I've spent decades watching politicians give interviews. I've seen them sweat under pressure. I've seen them dodge, deflect, and desperately try to change the subject when the questions get uncomfortable. I've watched leaders from both parties stumble through the most basic inquiries about their own policies. And I have to tell you, after everything I've witnessed in American politics, after everything I've seen in the last several years, especially what I just watched from Canada, genuinely stopped me in my tracks. This wasn't your typical political interview. This wasn't some carefully managed media appearance designed to avoid controversy. This was something else entirely. This was a leader who sounded like he actually knew what he was doing. And in the current climate, with everything happening south of the Canadian border, that kind of clarity, that kind of calm, that kind of confidence, it stands out in a way that should make every American sit up and pay attention to what's happening with our northern neighbor. I'm talking about Mark Carney's year-end interview. And I have to be honest with you, it's one of the most striking political performances I've seen in a very long time. Not performance in the theatrical sense, mind you. That's precisely what made it so remarkable. There was no theater here. There was no bluster. There was no chest thumping or name calling or wild accusations thrown around to distract from substance. Instead, there was something that has become increasingly rare in North American politics. There was a leader who spoke with precision, with patience, and with what I can only describe as genuine strategic vision. The contrast with what we've been experiencing here in the United States couldn't be more stark. And I think that contrast is exactly what Carney wanted the world to notice. He wanted Trump to notice. He wanted Americans to notice. And frankly, having watched it closely, I think he succeeded. The interview began with a question that cut right to the heart of the matter. With Trump facing midterm elections and the Supreme Court potentially ruling on whether his tariff scheme is even legal, the interviewer essentially asked Carney whether Canada's strategy might simply be to wait Trump out, to let events take over, to run out the clock until Washington's chaos resolves itself one way or another. Now, most politicians would have danced around that question. They would have offered platitudes about respecting the democratic process or hoping for constructive dialogue. Carney did neither. His response was direct, and it was devastating in its simplicity. He said, and I'm paraphrasing only slightly here, that certainly a strategy is not to rush into a bad deal. That's what they've been disciplined about. And then he added something that I think reveals the entire Canadian approach to this moment. He said that every week that goes by, the more Canada develops its economic strategy at home, the more it develops relationships abroad, the stronger Canada gets. Think about what he's actually saying there. He's saying that time is on Canada's side, not Trump's. He's saying that patience isn't weakness. Patience is power. What struck me most about that response was what Carney didn't do. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He didn't pound his fist or raise his voice or engage in any of the theatrical displays of strength that we've become so accustomed to in American politics. He simply stated a fact calmly and clearly and let the implications speak for themselves. Canada is getting stronger every single week this situation continues. Canada is building relationships around the world. Canada is developing its own capabilities and reducing its dependence on the United States. And meanwhile, what is happening here? Chaos, uncertainty, legal challenges, political turbulence, markets gyrating wildly based on whatever impulsive statement comes out of Washington on any given morning. Carney didn't need to point any of that out explicitly. The contrast made itself obvious. And that, I think, is the mark of genuinely sophisticated political communication. Sometimes the most powerful statement is the one you don't have to make out loud. Then came what I consider one of the most significant policy announcements embedded in this interview. Carn talked about defense spending, about the $80 billion Canada is investing in its military capabilities. But it wasn't just the number that caught my attention. It was where that money is going. For decades, and I mean literally for generations, Canada bought most of its defense equipment from the United States. 70 cents of every defense dollar, according to Carney, went south of the border to American contractors. That arrangement made sense in a world where the United States was a reliable ally, where the partnership between our two countries was built on mutual trust and shared values. But Carney made it abundantly clear that Canada no longer believes that world exists. That era is ending. Those defense dollars are now going to be spent in Canada, developing Canadian industry, building Canadian capability, creating Canadian jobs. This isn't just about military hardware. This is about sovereignty. This is about a country deciding that it can no longer afford to be dependent on a partner that has proven itself unreliable. And that more than anything else in this interview tells you exactly how much damage has been done to the relationship between our two countries. I want to pause on that point for a moment because I think Americans need to understand what's actually happening here. This isn't Canada throwing a tantrum. This isn't some temporary political spat that will blow over once everyone calms down. This is a fundamental reorientation of Canadian strategic thinking. They are actively working to reduce their dependence on the United States in every dimension: economic, military, political. They are building relationships with other partners around the world. They are investing in their own capabilities rather than relying on American systems and American contractors and American goodwill. And they are doing all of this not because they want to, not because they ever wanted the relationship to deteriorate to this point, but because they have concluded that they simply cannot rely on us anymore. When your closest ally, the country with whom you share the longest undefended border in the world, decides that they need to hedge against you, that they need to build alternatives to depending on you, that tells you something profound about how far things have fallen, and it should concern every American who cares about our standing in the world. What Carney revealed next in this interview genuinely surprised me, and I don't surprise easily when it comes to politics. He discussed the fact that conservative members of parliament, people who built their entire careers opposing the Liberal Party, have actually defected to support his government. Now, I've been around politics long enough to know that party switching happens. It's not unheard of. Politicians occasionally cross the aisle for various reasons, some principled, some purely opportunistic. But the way Carney described what's happening in Canada right now suggests something much more significant than typical political maneuvering. He made it clear that these conservative MPs weren't lured or courted in the traditional sense. They came willingly. They approached his government, not the other way around. They were attracted, as he put it, by what the government is actually doing. That distinction matters enormously. When opposition politicians voluntarily abandon their own party to support a leader from the other side, it tells you something important about the political gravity in that country. It tells you that even people who might disagree on policy, who might have spent years fighting against the Liberal Party on ideological grounds, have concluded that this particular moment requires something different. They've concluded that Canada's situation is serious enough that partisan considerations have to take a back seat to national interest. I found myself reflecting on what it would take for something similar to happen here in the United States. Can you imagine Republican members of Congress voluntarily defecting to support a Democratic president, not because they were promised committee assignments or campaign contributions or any of the usual inducements, but simply because they believed the country needed steady leadership in a moment of crisis? I struggle to picture it honestly. Our political culture has become so tribal, so consumed by partisan warfare, that the idea of putting country over party often seems like nothing more than an empty slogan. But in Canada, apparently, it's actually happening. Conservative MPs are looking at Mark Carney, looking at his calm demeanor and his clear strategy and his disciplined approach to an extraordinarily difficult situation. And they're concluding that this is the leadership Canada needs right now. They're concluding that even if they disagree with him on various policy matters, the alternative is worse. And I have to tell you, watching this from the American perspective, there's something both admirable and painful about seeing that kind of pragmatism in action. It reminds me of what politics could be if people actually took governing seriously. The interviewer pressed Carney on his identity as a politician, noting that he didn't used to describe himself that way. Carney acknowledged the shift with what I can only call refreshing honesty. He admitted that yes, he is now a politician. He is the prime minister after all, but he added that he's still a pragmatist. That combination, politician and pragmatist, isn't something we see very often. Most politicians are skilled at the political game, but seem to have forgotten or perhaps never learned how to actually solve problems and accomplish things. They know how to win elections, how to raise money, how to attack their opponents, how to generate outrage and harvest it for partisan advantage, but ask them to actually govern, to make difficult decisions, to build coalitions around practical solutions, and many of them seem completely lost. Carney, by contrast, came to politics from a completely different background. He ran the Bank of Canada, he ran the Bank of England, he navigated multiple financial crises and earned a reputation for competence and steady judgment in extraordinarily difficult circumstances. He wasn't trained in the art of political posturing. He was trained in the art of actually managing complex systems and getting things done. And you can see that difference in how he carries himself and how he answers questions and how he approaches the entire enterprise of leading a country. What I found particularly compelling was Carney's assessment of where Canada stands 9 months into his government. He didn't hedge or qualify or offer the usual politicians' disclaimers. He stated flatly that Canada is in a better position now than it was when he took office. The economy is better. They have a plan. They're implementing that plan and they're making progress internationally. They're becoming more independent as a country. Now, you might say that every politician claims things are going well under their leadership, and that's true to some extent, but there was something about the way Carney said it that conveyed genuine conviction rather than political spin. He wasn't puffing himself up or taking credit for things he didn't do. He was simply describing in his characteristically calm and factual manner the trajectory he believes Canada is on. And given everything I've observed about how he conducts himself, I'm inclined to believe he actually means it. He actually believes Canada is getting stronger, more capable, more independent. And honestly, watching from here in the United States, watching our own political dysfunction and chaos and uncertainty, I don't find that claim hard to believe at all. Then came what might be the most consequential revelation in the entire interview. And I want to make sure people understand just how significant this is. Carney explained that virtually everybody in the world wants to do more with Canada right now. He wasn't exaggerating for effect. He wasn't engaging in wishful thinking. He laid out specific examples that make the case undeniably clear. Asian countries want to work with Canada. The Philippines, Thailand, Singapore, the entire ASEAN bloc representing almost a quarter of global GDP. Indonesia wants to work with Canada. The European Union wants to work with Canada. The United Kingdom wants to work with Canada. The Gulf states want to work with Canada. And then he dropped what I consider the most stunning detail of all. The United Arab Emirates has committed to investing $70 billion in Canada. $70 billion. And according to Carney, Canada didn't even ask for it. They volunteered. They came to Canada because they want to be partners with a country that has what the world wants, that has values the world respects, that offers reliability and stability and predictability at a time when those qualities are in desperately short supply. Think about what that means in the broader context of global affairs. For decades, the United States was the indispensable nation. We were the country everyone wanted to work with, invest in, partner with. Our stability, our rule of law, our predictable institutions. These were our greatest strategic assets. They made us attractive to allies and investors alike. They gave us leverage in every negotiation because everyone knew that a deal with America would be honored, that American commitments meant something, that American institutions would outlast any particular administration. But what Carney is describing suggests that calculus is shifting in real time. The world is looking at Trump's America and seeing chaos, unpredictability, tariffs imposed on a whim, allies treated like adversaries, fundamental norms violated on a daily basis. And then they're looking at Canada and seeing something very different. They're seeing stability, they're seeing reliability, they're seeing a government with a coherent plan and the discipline to execute it. And they're making rational decisions based on that contrast. They're choosing Canada not because Canada is perfect, not because Canada has suddenly become a superpower, but because Canada is offering something America no longer seems capable of providing trust. I want to spend some time on something Carney said that really crystallized the shift in Canada's global position because I think it illustrates just how dramatically the landscape has changed. He talked about the coalition of the willing supporting Ukraine. Now, that phrase coalition of the willing has a particular resonance for those of us who remember the lead up to the Iraq War. Back then, the United States assembled its own coalition of the willing to support that military intervention. We were the ones doing the assembling. We were the ones setting the agenda. We were the indispensable nation around which other countries organized themselves. But look at what's happening now. There's a coalition of the willing supporting Ukraine, and the United States is not a member. Let me say that again because I think it bears repeating. There is an international coalition working to support Ukraine to help shape the possibility of a lasting peace, and America is not part of it. Not. Canada is, major European countries are, Australia is, the United Kingdom is, but the United States under this administration has stepped back from that role. We've abdicated our position, and Canada, along with other allies, has stepped into the vacuum we left behind. This represents something far more significant than a single policy disagreement about Ukraine. It represents a fundamental reordering of how the democratic world organizes itself. For generations, the assumption was always the same. America leads, everyone else follows. American power, American resources, American diplomatic weight, these were the foundation on which international coalitions were built. But when America stops leading, when America becomes unreliable, when America starts treating its allies as adversaries and its adversaries as friends, other countries have to adapt. They have to find new ways of organizing themselves. They have to build coalitions without us. And that's exactly what's happening right now. Carney described Canada's role in this new reality not with arrogance or triumphalism, but with a kind of sober recognition of what the moment demands. Canada is helping to shape international outcomes, not because Canada sought this role, not because Canada ever wanted to replace American leadership, but because someone has to do it. Someone has to step up. And if America won't, then America's allies will figure out how to proceed without us. What makes this particularly striking is the contrast in how Carney handles pressure compared to what we've grown accustomed to seeing from American leaders. The interviewer at one point essentially called him a hypocrite. This was about the Memorandum of Understanding with Alberta regarding pipeline expansion. After spending so much of his career warning about climate change, after building a reputation as someone deeply concerned about environmental issues, here was Carney backing an expansion of the oil sands. The journalist didn't soften the accusation. He asked directly whether Carney looked like a hypocrite. Now, I've seen countless politicians faced with that kind of pointed challenge, and the responses almost always follow a predictable pattern. They get defensive, they get angry, they attack the premise of the question, they accuse the interviewer of bias or unfairness, they do everything they can to avoid actually engaging with the substance of the accusation. Carney did none of that. He stayed completely composed. He didn't raise his voice or show any sign of being rattled. He simply laid out his reasoning in clear, logical terms. His explanation was genuinely sophisticated, and I say that as someone who has followed climate and energy policy debates for many years. He started with the basic reality that the world is going to use hydrocarbons for coming decades. That's not a wish or a preference. That's just the factual reality under virtually any scenario, including the most aggressive climate action scenarios modeled by the International Energy Agency. Even under net zero projections, the world will still be using 25 to 30 million barrels of oil per day, down from 100 million, yes, but still substantial. Given that reality, Carney argued, the question becomes, what kind of oil will be used? And his answer was clear: low cost, low risk, low carbon. That last point, low carbon, is what makes the Alberta Agreement defensible in his view. At the center of the memorandum is a project called Pathways that will remove 16 megat tons of carbon from Alberta's oil production. That's the equivalent, he explained, of taking 90% of the cars and trucks in Alberta off the road. In other words, if the world is going to keep using oil, regardless of what Canada does, better that it be oil produced with minimal carbon emissions than oil produced in countries with far worse environmental standards. You may agree with that logic or you may disagree with it. That's a legitimate policy debate, and reasonable people can come down on different sides. But what you cannot deny is that Carney clearly knows what he's talking about. He wasn't winging it. He wasn't making things up. He wasn't trying to change the subject or attack the interviewer for asking an uncomfortable question. He engaged directly with the substance, laid out his reasoning, acknowledged the tensions and trade-offs involved, and defended his position with evidence and logic. That's what actual leadership looks like. That's what it means to take policy seriously rather than treating every question as just another opportunity for political theater. And watching it from here, watching it after years of American politics dominated by bluster and bullying and proud ignorance, I found it genuinely refreshing. I found myself thinking, this is what it looks like when a country is led by someone who actually understands complex issues and can articulate coherent strategies for addressing them. The environmental dimension of this interview deserves more attention because it illustrates something important about how Carney approaches difficult trade-offs. Climate change is real, the science is clear, the risks are enormous. Carney has spent years warning about these dangers, and there's no reason to doubt his genuine commitment to addressing them. But he also recognizes that governing a real country, with a real economy and real people, whose livelihoods depend on fossil fuel industries, requires more than ideological purity. It requires finding ways to transition toward a cleaner future while also meeting the needs of the present. It requires acknowledging that you can't simply shut down industries overnight and expect everything to work out. It requires the kind of pragmatic, incremental progress that purists on both sides often dismiss, but that actually produces real improvements in the real world. That's the approach Carney is taking. And whether you agree with every specific decision or not, it's hard to deny that it reflects a serious engagement with the genuine complexity of these issues. What I kept coming back to throughout this interview was the sheer contrast in temperament and approach between Carney and the American leader who has created this entire crisis. On one side, you have Trump with his constant chaos, his impulsive tariffs, his attacks on allies, his embrace of authoritarians, his complete lack of coherent strategy or disciplined execution. On the other side, you have Carney with his calm, his patience, his clear articulation of goals and methods, his willingness to engage substantively with difficult questions. It's not just a difference in policy, it's a difference in fundamental approach to leadership. Trump seems to believe that strength is demonstrated through volume and aggression, through dominating every interaction, through never admitting error or uncertainty. Carney seems to believe that strength is demonstrated through competence and consistency, through having a plan and executing it, through building genuine capabilities rather than just talking about them. These are fundamentally different visions of what leadership means. And watching them play out side by side, it's hard for me to see how anyone could look at the evidence and conclude that Trump's approach is producing better results. As I reflect on everything I witnessed in this interview, I keep returning to one inescapable conclusion. We are watching a fundamental shift in how Canada sees itself and its place in the world. And that shift has profound implications, not just for Canada, but for the United States and for the entire international order that has prevailed since the end of World War II. For decades, the relationship between our two countries operated on certain assumptions that everyone took for granted. Canada was the junior partner. Canada was the quieter voice. Canada was protected by proximity to American power and could therefore afford to focus on other priorities while America handled the heavy lifting of global leadership. Those assumptions are no longer operative. What Carney demonstrated in this interview is that Canada has concluded correctly, in my view, that it can no longer rely on the United States in the way it once did. And rather than lamenting that reality or waiting passively for America to come to its senses, Canada is adapting. Canada is building its own strength. Canada is forging its own partnerships. Canada is charting its own course. The strategic patience that Carney articulated throughout this interview represents a sophisticated understanding of leverage and timing that seems completely absent from American policy right now. Trump's approach to international relations is fundamentally transactional and short-term. He imposes tariffs and expects immediate capitulation. He makes threats and expects instant compliance. Carney, by contrast, is playing a longer game. He understands that Canada doesn't need to win every battle today. Canada just needs to keep getting stronger, keep building capabilities, keep developing relationships, keep demonstrating reliability to the rest of the world. Every week that passes without a bad deal is a week that Canada uses to improve its position. Eventually, the pressure will be on Trump, not on Canada.